The winter dawn crouched low over the lonely station, pressing its pale breath against the earth as though trying to hush the world into stillness. Frost clung to the wooden beams like silver moss, and every plank of the platform groaned at the cold settling deep into its grain. A tired lantern swung from a rusty hook, its dim glow trembling across the boards, offering more comfort than warmth. Alara Sattler sat beneath it, shoulders curled inward, hands locked around the handle of her worn brown satchel, as though it were the last loyal thing she possessed. Her thin blue dress fluttered whenever the wind swept past, a fragile banner in a land that did not care to notice the people it chilled. She watched the horizon as if waiting for something to rise from it, something kinder than the day behind her and braver than the one ahead. Her breath left her lips in faint clouds, quickly swallowed by the morning. She counted them without meaning to, letting each exhale mark the slow drift of time. Every passing minute reminded her that the supply cart she was promised was late again, and each delay added another stone to the weight pressing behind her ribs. Her late husband's debts had devoured her home, eaten through her privacy, erased whatever dignity she once believed was hers. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that someone might send help, or at least speak her name with mercy. But winter did not bend for widows, and townsfolk bent even less. She tucked her chin deeper into her chest, trying to keep her heartbeat quiet, as though the cold might hear it and take offense. A distant horse snorted, a deep rumbling sound that broke through the muffled quiet. Alara lifted her gaze. At the far end of the platform, half swallowed by the soft gold haze of early morning, a massive figure tended to a dark-coated horse. The man was shirtless despite the dawn's bite, his broad, muscular shoulders rising like carved stone above the mist. Steam lifted from his skin each time he moved, curling around him, as though the world tried to warm itself on his presence. She recognized the tall, quiet Apache, who sometimes passed through town on errands of his own. Dason Blackthorn. Few spoke to him, and fewer seemed willing to see him as anything but a storm waiting to break. Yet Alara noticed something different. The gentleness in his movements, the way he soothed his restless horse with slow, steady strokes, patient as the old cottonwood trees. She tried not to stare, but her eyes betrayed her, drawn toward him as though the morning itself leaned in that direction. Dason's presence seemed to hold the cold at bay, not by fighting it, but by refusing to acknowledge it. She envied that strength. Her fingers trembled around her satchel strap, and for a heartbeat she wondered if she ought to ask him for help loading the few crates she still needed to move. But the thought dissolved quickly. People expected widows to be quiet, invisible, compliant. She had learned to expect the same of herself. Approaching a man like him, tall, powerful, unbothered by the world's opinion, felt impossible. She feared her voice would vanish before it reached him. A sudden gust swept across the platform, tugging sharply at her satchel. The latch snapped open, and the scattered remnants of her life tumbled across the boards. A folded handkerchief stitched by her mother, a cracked tin of sewing needles, 2 letters she could not bring herself to burn. She gasped and scrambled forward, but her chilled fingers fumbled helplessly against the wind. Before she could gather half of it, heavy footsteps crossed the platform. A large hand reached the fallen satchel first, lifting it with such care that she froze. Dason knelt beside her, silent as snowfall, and began collecting the scattered items one by one. He handled each object with a reverence that made her throat tighten, as though he knew the weight of small treasures in a world eager to steal them. He placed the last letter into her satchel, folding the flap gently, and held it out to her with both hands. She saw then that the scar across his left shoulder caught the light like white paint on bronze skin. Dason did not speak. He simply waited for her to take the satchel, lowering his gaze in a gesture that surprised her. Respect, not intimidation. Alara accepted it, her fingertips brushing his briefly. The warmth of his skin startled her, a sudden contrast to the air's relentless cold. She managed a soft thank you, her voice barely more than a breath. His expression shifted slightly, not into a smile, but into something softer, something halfway between understanding and careful distance. Then he rose to his full height, towering above her, yet nothing in him felt threatening. The train whistle cried faintly from somewhere far beyond the hills, a lonesome sound that tangled itself with the ache in her chest. Alara stared at the empty tracks stretching toward a future she could not imagine. She wondered who she was now, without a home, without a plan, without anyone to speak her name with gentle familiarity. The cold pressed harder, burrowing past her dress, and she pulled her shawl tighter, determined not to let her hands shake again. Behind her, she sensed Dason lingering, as though reluctant to walk away until he was certain she was steady. But the townspeople, if they saw them together, would talk. They always talked when it hurt most. Footsteps approached from the road, boots crunching over frost. Two men from town, faces she recognized but never trusted, slowed as they passed. Their eyes flicked between her and Dason with pointed curiosity. One muttered something to the other, and both chuckled before continuing toward the general store. Alara felt heat bloom beneath her skin, not from cold, but from shame she didn't deserve. She lowered her gaze, wishing she could disappear. Dason shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself between her and the retreating men, a subtle shield she hadn't asked for. Something in that gesture, unspoken, protective, unassuming, pressed hard against the fragile parts of her heart. In the quiet that followed, the snow began again, soft flakes drifting through the weak morning light. They clung to Dason's hair, dotted his shoulders, melted against the warmth of his skin. Alara watched them fall, feeling as though the world had paused just long enough for her to breathe. She wondered if fate sometimes placed people in one another's path not to change their lives, but to remind them they were still capable of being seen. She had not felt seen in a long time. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a low, distant rumble. No train, no cart, just the warning of an approaching storm. Dason looked toward the horizon, jaw tightening. Alara followed his gaze, heart sinking as she recognized the heavy clouds gathering like bruises across the sky. The supply cart would not arrive. The road would soon be impassable. She was stranded, with nowhere to go and no way to leave. She clutched her satchel to her chest, trying to steady her breath, but fear slipped through her fingers like melting ice. When she looked back at Dason, she found him watching her with quiet intensity, as though he already knew her fear, as though he had heard it before she spoke. And in that solemn gaze something shifted, subtle yet unmistakable. The first tremor of a connection neither of them had expected, and neither of them was prepared to name. Snow thickened its veil over the road as Alara stepped away from the desolate station. Her satchel pressed tight against her ribs, her breath whispering into the wind like a secret she feared the world might misuse. She walked slowly, boots tapping a tired rhythm against the frozen ground, trying to ignore how her limbs trembled from cold and dread. Behind her, heavy footsteps followed at a respectful distance, steady and patient, belonging unmistakably to Dason Blackthorne, whose presence felt like a silent vow carved into the winter air. She did not turn, though she sensed him watching the uncertain way she braced herself against each gust. The townspeople's roofs came into view through the drifting white, clustered like guarded eyes waiting to judge her return. Alara wished she could shrink small enough to slip past unnoticed, but winters in Wyoming carried every story on their winds, and gossip moved quicker than smoke through a chimney. As she approached the first storefront, she lifted her chin, summoning whatever scraps of dignity the season had not yet stolen. A pair of ranch hands paused near the hitching post, their laughter softening as they noticed her. One of them, Clyde Mercer, straightened with a slow, smug curl of his lip, as if fate had handed him a moment he had long hoped for. Clyde had once courted her with the enthusiasm of a man chasing an easy future, but when hardship came, he vanished from her life faster than dust before wind. Now he regarded her with the hollow triumph of someone who believed abandonment a wise decision. "Alara, back already?" Clyde drawled, his voice sharp enough to cut through the snowfall. "Thought you'd finally run out of places to beg." His companion snickered, but the sound died quickly when Dason emerged from the drifting white behind her, towering like a figure carved out of some old mountain legend. Clyde's smugness flickered into uncertainty, yet he held his stance, unwilling to yield ground before a man he barely understood. Alara felt heat rise beneath her skin, humiliation clinging to her like ice that refused to melt. Dason did not touch her, yet his nearness felt like a shield raised without ceremony. He spoke her name softly, not to claim her, but to steady her trembling breath. Alara startled. She had not realized how close she was to breaking until she heard her own name carried on his quiet voice. The ranch hands exchanged glances, their bravado wilting beneath the stark contrast between their cruelty and Dayson's unspoken restraint. Clyde muttered something about misplaced charity, but the wind devoured his words before anyone cared to listen. Alara continued toward town, hoping the tightness in her chest would ease once she put distance between herself and the confrontation. But Dayson followed with the same respectful space he had held at the station. She told herself she did not need his protection, yet she felt oddly grateful for it, as though his steady presence kept her from collapsing beneath the weight of shame and exhaustion. Her steps slowed near the general store, where lantern light spilled across the snow like a promise of temporary refuge. Mrs. Merritt appeared in the doorway, gray shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the pair approaching. She greeted Alara with a warmth that made the younger woman's vision blur for a heartbeat, then shifted her attention to Dayson with cautious respect. The older woman had always been kinder than most, though she understood too well how swiftly small towns turn kindness into ammunition. She stepped aside, letting Alara enter first, but paused when Dayson lingered just outside the threshold, as if unsure he belonged within its glow. "Alara," Mrs. Merritt said gently, "you look frozen through." She fetched a small tin cup of warm broth and pressed it into her hands. As the heat seeped into her fingers, Alara fought the trembling in her jaw. She murmured that she was managing, though the words tasted hollow. When she glanced toward the door, Dayson still waited outside the circle of lantern light, snow gathering on his shoulders like he had chosen to stand between the storm and every stranger passing the street. She stepped back out, broth warming her palms, and met his gaze with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Why was he following her through a town that barely tolerated him? Dayson shifted his weight, as though preparing to speak, but the words seemed tangled behind his steady eyes. At last, he lowered them briefly, a humility she did not expect from someone built like a warrior. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged low, roughened by cold yet carried by an earnestness that struck something tender inside her. "I can help," he said, the simplicity of it landing heavier than any elaborate promise. "Let me stay nearby. I can cook. Carry burdens you cannot. I will pack your things if you wish to leave this place." His words were not desperate, but they carried a raw sincerity that unsettled her, for no one had spoken to her without hidden intent in a very long time. She stared at him, snow drifting around them, wondering why a man like him would make such an offer to someone whose life had been whittled down to a satchel of memories and a reputation wrapped in whispers. Before she found an answer, Clyde's voice cut through the hush, cruel and triumphant. "Careful, widow. Men don't offer charity for nothing." Alara flinched, expecting Dayson to bristle, but instead he remained still, serene, as though Clyde's venom could not reach wherever he kept his dignity. She realized then that his offer wasn't pity. It was a bridge extended across the emptiness swallowing her life. And just as she tried to shape a reply, a sudden crack of thunder rolled over the rooftops, foreboding, promising a storm that neither of them were prepared to face alone just then. The storm chased Alara and Dayson across the open stretch between town and the lonely cabin she still called hers out of habit more than certainty. Snow swirled in frantic spirals, needling her cheeks and settling in her hair like stubborn ghosts. She kept her head lowered, boots crunching through the thickening drifts, each step feeling heavier than the last. Dayson walked beside her now, not behind, his presence anchoring the shifting world around them. Though the wind howled against them, he moved with quiet steadiness, as if the storm respected him enough to part at his shoulders. Alara tried not to lean toward that steadiness, but something in her resisted the idea of walking alone. When they reached the clearing, the cabin appeared through the curtain of snow like a memory half frozen in time. Its roof sagged slightly under the weight of neglect, its windows recalled the weak flicker of forgotten warmth, and its crooked porch steps looked as though they'd collapse if touched by anything heavier than a wandering thought. Alara paused at the edge of the clearing, breath trembling, as though afraid the cabin would scold her for returning without hope. Dayson studied it with careful attention, not judgment, as though he were reading the shape of her life through its battered frame. Without speaking, he stepped ahead and tested the porch boards with one broad foot, before offering her a nod of reassurance. She followed him up the steps, letting the familiarity of the creaking would soothe the ache curling inside her. Inside, the cabin greeted them with stale air and a faint scent of cedar that clung stubbornly to the hearth. Dust softened the edges of every surface, and the cold had seeped deep into the walls, claiming the space as its own. Alara set her satchel on the small table near the window, fingers brushing across the smooth wood her late husband once sanded with pride. She wondered how he would feel knowing she'd returned with a giant Apache stranger beside her, though she quickly banished the thought. The dead held no say over the living's need to survive. Dason closed the door quietly behind them, his presence filling the small room with an unexpected sense of security. He moved toward the fireplace without waiting for direction, kneeling as though he'd tended it 100 times. Alara watched him stack kindling and logs with a practiced precision that contrasted with his massive frame. A few sparks coaxed from flint soon blossomed into a timid flame, its orange glow flickering across his skin like warm breath. She felt heat return to her fingers, radiating outward until some of the numbness in her chest began to thaw. Dason did not look at her while he worked, but she sensed he noticed every breath she took, every tremor she tried to hide. When the fire grew strong enough to fight the cold, he finally lifted his gaze, asking silently whether she approved. She offered a small nod, grateful for the light yet uncertain how to express it aloud. Dason stood, scanning the room with the quiet curiosity of someone entering sacred ground. His eyes drifted over the rocking chair, the small shelf lined with a few faded books, the quilt resting over the back of the settee. Alara's mother had sewn that quilt stitch by stitch, weaving hope into every pattern. She suddenly felt exposed, as if her memories lay unfolded before him. But he did not touch anything without invitation. Instead, he moved to the kitchen corner, examining the meager supplies she had left behind after leaving in haste. He found dried beans, a few potatoes tucked into a crate, and a small bundle of herbs hanging near the window. With each discovery, he seemed to weigh the limits of what could be made warm and nourishing in such a place. Alara felt a pang of embarrassment. She had little to offer, and yet this man stood in her cabin as though he had chosen it. When he began preparing a pot of stew, Alara found herself drawn closer, compelled by the rhythmic calm of his movements. His hands were large, scarred in places, yet astonishingly gentle as he handled each ingredient. The scent of simmering beans and herbs soon lifted through the cabin, softening the cold's grip. Dason ladled the stew into 2 wooden bowls, handing her one with both hands, a gesture of respect that startled her. She accepted it carefully, grateful for its warmth, and they ate in quiet companionship. The crackle of fire and the whisper of wind outside filled the spaces words might have occupied. For the first time in days, Alara felt her heartbeat slow enough to hear the quieter thoughts she usually ignored. When they finished, Dason stepped outside briefly to gather more wood, returning with an armful that dwarfed the small pile beside the hearth. Alara watched him work, noticing the reverence with which he moved, as though repairing the cabin were repairing something inside himself. She found herself studying the lines of his expression when he wasn't looking. How his eyes carried shadows of places she could not name, how his jaw tightened whenever he sensed her unease, how he always seemed to hold his strength back rather than impose it. She wondered what life had shaped such restraint into a man so capable of force. Her curiosity surprised her, but even more surprising was the comfort she felt in his silent company. As the fire settled into a steady glow, she finally broke the quiet. She thanked him, voice soft but sincere, for helping without asking anything in return. Dason met her gaze with a calm she did not expect. He told her in simple words that offering help did not require reward. His voice carried a sincerity that felt both comforting and dangerous, as though his kindness might unravel her defenses if she looked at it too closely. She realized then how long it had been since someone had spoken to her without suspicion or demand. The realization stung her eyes with an unexpected heat. Outside, the storm roared against the cabin walls, testing their strength, rattling the thin windows. Alara flinched as a sudden gust slammed the shutters, and Dason rose instantly to secure them. His movements were swift but controlled, protective without chaos. She watched him brace the latch, his silhouette outlined by the firelight, and something inside her shifted. Something she did not yet understand, but could no longer ignore. When he returned to the hearth, the room felt smaller, warmer, yet threaded with a new tension that curled around them like unseen smoke. Dason settled on the floor near the fire, allowing distance but not detachment. Alara lowered herself into the rocking chair, clutching her mother's quilt around her shoulders. The warmth seeped through her, anchoring her to the present in a way that felt dangerously close to hope. She wondered if she should ask him to leave once the storm cleared, but the thought sparked an ache she did not want to examine. Instead, she listened to the storm beat against the cabin and let the silence between them deepen, not with discomfort, but with possibility. When the fire dipped low, Dason added one last log, then turned to her, his expression unreadable yet softened by the flickering light. Snow battered the windows with relentless force, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine that the world outside had vanished, leaving only the quiet sanctuary shared by two weary souls. But just as her breath steadied, a sharp crack echoed from the porch, loud enough to jolt her upright. Dason's head snapped toward the sound, muscles tensing, eyes sharpening with alertness. The storm was not their only visitor tonight. The dawn after the storm arrived bruised and heavy, its pale light slipping through the cabin window like an apology that came too late. Alara woke to the soft crackle of the dying fire, and the quiet weight of knowing the world beyond those walls had not changed simply because she had found a moment of warmth beside Dason. He was already outside, stacking what he had chopped before sunrise, his movements steady despite the bitter cold settling into the earth. She stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight, watching the breath rise from him in soft plumes. He paused when he noticed her, offering a brief nod, neither distant nor intrusive. For a moment, the world felt simple. She wished it could remain that way, but the faint echo of distant voices reminded her that the town had long memories and sharp tongues. She sensed trouble in the crisp air before she saw the riders approaching through the thinning fog. Two men halted at the edge of her clearing, mounted on restless horses. Marshal Denton led them, his expression carved into stern lines that made the morning feel colder. He tipped his hat out of habit rather than courtesy, eyes flicking from Alara to Dason with the scrutiny of someone already shaping a narrative. His deputy lingered behind, eager and indelicate, gaze sliding over Dason with unmistakable suspicion. Alara felt her chest tighten, as though the air had thickened. "Morning, Widow Sattler," the marshal said, voice flat as iron. "Heard you had company through the storm." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Dason stood still, not bristling, not shrinking, simply existing with a dignity that made the deputy's smirk deepen. Alara forced herself to stand straighter, summoning a calm she did not feel, and told the marshal that Dason had helped her when she needed it most. Her words were steady, but her hands trembled beneath her shawl. Marshal Denton's gaze narrowed. "Town's uneasy," he said. "Storm brought more than snow. Brought talk. And talk turns to trouble when folks feel threatened." His deputy added something crude under his breath, earning a half-hearted rebuke. Alara felt her cheeks burn, not from shame, but from the injustice curling its way into her throat. Dason remained silent, though she sensed the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior, a quiet readiness to defend without violence. Clyde Mercer rode up moments later, drawn by rumor like a crow to carrion. His smirk returned when he spotted Dason near the woodpile. Clyde conjured a lie with unsettling ease, claiming Dason had threatened him the previous afternoon. The marshal watched Dason's reaction closely, but Dason only met Clyde's accusation with a gaze so steady it unsettled the ranch hand. Alara spoke up, saying Clyde had provoked them both with insults, but her voice felt small against the tide of prejudice rolling toward them. Mrs. Merritt's arrival offered brief relief. She marched into the clearing with her shawl whipping in the wind, scolding the deputy for assuming guilt without cause. Her presence softened the marshal's sharpness for a moment, but not enough to erase the doubts they carried. She reached Alara's side, slipping a reassuring hand through her arm, but even her kindness could not untangle the knot forming in Alara's stomach. She knew how fragile reputations were in a place that thrived on whisper. After the riders left, Dason remained at the edge of the clearing, his expression unreadable. Alara approached him, fighting the sense that something precious was slipping through her fingers. She thanked him again, her voice quieter now, laced with the fear that her gratitude was not enough to shield him from consequences. He listened without interruption, eyes reflecting a mixture of resolve and sorrow, as though he had long expected the world to turn against him, no matter how he chose to live. She told him he had done nothing wrong. The wind carried her words away before they reached him fully. He stepped closer, lowering his gaze to hers, and spoke with careful restraint. "Trouble follows me," he said softly. "I do not want it to follow you." His words struck deeper than any accusation thrown by the townsman. She realized then that his leaving would not be an act of rejection, but of protection, and the thought tightened her throat with unexpected grief. Alara insisted she did not blame him for the world's cruelty, but Dason shook his head with gentle finality. He glanced toward the cabin, toward the fire he had tended with such quiet devotion, then back to her with an expression that held more apology than he voiced. Snow began to fall again, not heavy but persistent, like the sky offering a reluctant warning. She felt it settle on her lashes as he told her he should go before rumors rooted themselves too deep. She wanted to reach for him, to ask him to stay just a little longer, but fear coiled through her, whispering that wanting anything too deeply invited loss. She watched him gather his few belongings, movements slow, deliberate, as though prolonging the inevitable. Her heart pulled at her ribs, begging her to speak, yet her voice failed her until he stood at the edge of the clearing. She managed only his name, soft as a plea, but he did not turn fully, only enough for her to glimpse the pain he tried to conceal. "I will not bring harm to your door," he murmured, barely audible over the wind. "Not when you have already carried so much." Then he walked into the snowfall, leaving no promise of return, only the imprint of his footsteps fading beneath the growing white. Alara stood motionless, breath trapped in her lungs, the cold creeping back into the spaces his presence had warmed. As the storm gathered once more, a hollow silence settled over the land, broken only by the faint, distant howl of wolves rising from the woods, an omen that she was more alone than she had been the day before, and that the night ahead would demand a courage she did not yet know she possessed. The snow came fast that night, tumbling from the heavens in thick, frantic sheets that swallowed the horizon and erased the familiar world beyond Alara's fragile cabin walls. The storm howled as if determined to tear the earth open, rattling the shutters until they groaned in protest. Alara sat near the hearth with her quilt wrapped around her shoulders, though the fire seemed too small to warm the hollow ache inside her. Dason's absence had carved a space in the room that refused to stay quiet. Every shadow reminded her of the silhouette that had stood by her door that morning, promising safety even as he walked away from it. The memory pressed hard against her heart until she felt breathless. She rose when the wind struck the porch again, sharper this time, like something clawing at the door. Wolves cried somewhere in the distance, their voices carried by the storm. She tried to calm herself, telling her mind they were far, telling her heart she was safe, but each crash of thunder hollowed her courage further. She paced the small cabin, listening to the storm's wild tantrum, wishing for the steady presence she had let walk into the snow. She whispered to herself that she had done the right thing letting him go, sparing him the town's venom, sparing him the trouble she seemed cursed to gather around her. But the words felt brittle, unconvincing, cracking in her throat like frozen twigs. A sudden thud against the porch jolted her. The wind dropped for a heartbeat, and she heard it. Heavy footsteps slogging through deep snow, growing closer, urgent. She froze, fingers clutching the edge of the table. The world outside roared again, but beneath it she recognized a rhythm she had come to know. Steady, deliberate, powerful. Before she could move, the latch rattled, and the door heaved open against the storm. Dason burst inside, his shoulders dusted with snow, hair soaked, eyes burning with something raw and unhidden. He slammed the door shut behind him, and braced his back against it, chest rising in sharp breaths as though he had outrun the storm itself. Alara's voice broke on his name. He lifted his gaze to her with an intensity that rooted her in place. Snow melted down his jaw, catching the firelight like falling stars, and for a moment she could only stare, stunned by the sight of him returning through a night that would have swallowed a weaker man whole. He stepped forward, slowly, as if afraid to startle her. She moved toward him without thinking, driven by something stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. When they met in the middle of the room, the world outside seemed to fold away, leaving only the raw electricity gathered between them. "I should not have left," Dason said, voice thick with cold and something deeper. "The storm turned fast. I worried you would be alone in it." She swallowed hard, wanting to tell him she had been more than alone. She had been undone. but the words tangled behind her ribs. The wind lashed against the cabin again, and Dason glanced toward the door as though ready to defend her from the night itself. His instincts both comforted and pained her, reminding her how much he carried, how much he always stood ready to bear, even when she pushed him away. He reached for the edge of her quilt, brushing it lightly between his fingers. "You should not face storms alone," he murmured. She felt her breath shudder, not from cold but from the tenderness threaded through his voice. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him, close enough to see the tiny flecks of ice melting on his lashes. The fire cracked behind them, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. Her heartbeat pulsed loudly in her ears, a drum calling her toward a truth she could no longer deny. "Why did you come back?" she whispered. It was both invitation and plea. Dason's jaw tightened, his eyes shifting with conflict, as though he stood at the edge of something he had vowed never to cross. He lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to refuse him, but she did not move away. His palm brushed her cheek, warm despite the frigid night. She leaned into his touch, feeling the world steady for the first time since he left. "I came back because I could not leave you in danger," he said, his voice barely holding together. "I came back because the storm was cruel, and the wolves were close, and the thought of you afraid." His breath shook. It tore at me. Alara closed her eyes briefly, letting the truth settle over her like a heavy, healing blanket. When she opened them again, she found him watching her with a vulnerability she had never seen in him before. Something inside him cracked open, and the truth he had held too tightly spilled free. "I came back," he whispered, "because I love you." The words struck her like light breaking through a shroud. They were not loud or dramatic. They were soft, reverent, spoken like a vow to the earth. She inhaled sharply, hand lifting to rest against his chest, feeling the tremor beneath his ribs. He bowed his head slightly, as if confessing something sacred. "Your kindness," he continued. "Your quiet strength. The way you see the world, even when it turns against you. You make me want to stay in a world that has not been kind to me." Tears gathered in her eyes, shimmering like fragile crystals. She wanted to speak, to answer his honesty with her own, but emotion swelled until words felt too small. She let her hand slide up to his jaw, guiding his face toward hers, anchoring him. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of needing someone again. Afraid of losing someone again. Afraid of wanting you because it meant I could be hurt." His eyes softened with a tenderness she had never dared hope for. "But I missed you the moment you walked away." He covered her hand with his own, holding it like a promise. The storm growled outside, shaking the cabin, punctuating the gravity of the moment. Dason leaned forward, forehead resting gently against hers. Their breaths mingled, warm and slow. "You will not be alone again," he said. "Not if you choose me." Her heartbeat steadied, a quiet anchor in the chaos. She felt the truth settle deep within her, blooming through the cracks left by loss. "Then stay," she murmured. "Stay with me." Before he could answer, a low feral howl rose outside. Close, too close. Dason turned sharply, hand dropping to the knife at his belt. The wolves had followed him through the storm. Alara felt fear spike, but he moved with calm assurance, stepping between her and the door. The firelight glinted off the blade's edge as he waited. The howl came again, scraping against the cabin walls like a warning. Dason glanced back at her, eyes burning with devotion and resolve. "I will protect you," he vowed. Lightning flared beyond the window, illuminating their faces in stark, fleeting brilliance. She met his gaze, no longer afraid of wanting him, no longer afraid of the future forming between them. Outside, claws scraped across the porch. Inside, two hearts beat with fierce, unyielding clarity. The door shuddered once, hard, followed by a growl that vibrated through the floorboards. And then, another sound, nearer, heavier. Bootsteps. A human silhouette looming through the frosted glass. Someone else had come through the storm. Someone who was not a wolf.